On this episode of Maybe God.
I think people get a really warped sense of who God is. You know, they see him as this Puritan laying down the law, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I don't see God like that at all. What does it say about God that he created the orgasm? Think about that. This is a God of pleasure.
She's on a mission to change the way we think about sexuality as it relates to spirituality.
What do you wish LGBT people and communities knew about God that maybe they're not hearing from churches?
God's table is open to all. God has a big table and everyone is invited. You know, Jesus goes the extra mile to make sure people are included.
It's my no-holds-barred conversation with Debra Hirsch, author of Redeeming Sex.
I remember coming out of porn, there was a season where I genuinely had to retrain my brain how to think about sex with my wife.
It's all coming up on episode 3 of Maybe God. We can find millions of reasons why we're all different. But there's one question that every human ponders at some point in their lives. How did we get here? No one knows. Maybe we're a cosmic accident, or maybe God did it. I'm Eric Huffman. This is Maybe God. What if sex isn't just about sex? What if the reason we're so fixated on sex is because we're really looking for something else? Transcendence, immortality, or just to not feel so alone? These are the questions that keep today's guest up at night. Deb Hirsch is a pastor who counsels people struggling with issues related to sex and sexuality. The first time I heard Deb speak, she said two things that really struck a chord with me. First, she said we should expect heaven to be like one endless, earth-shattering orgasm. Before that, I thought of heaven being more like an endless church service, so an eternal orgasm sounded like an upgrade. Second, she told a room full of evangelicals to stop singling out gay sex as the sin of sins. And I can't imagine a more important conversation to have in our culture right now than one about the intersection between our sexuality and our spirituality. And I found Deb's story so compelling that I flew to Los Angeles to hear it in person.
So I really grew up in a household where my mother was, nominal Catholic and Dad nominal Protestant in a sense. And I only knew that because they didn't know what church to get married in. But my dad didn't believe in God, and I grew up thinking Protestants didn't believe in God. And that probably goes to my lack of education as well. But, as a young girl, I remember having a lot of terror and fear one night as I contemplated life and reality. And I've come to realize that was actually God's first calling. I was facing my existence, I guess, was that sense of existential angst and horror. And
what were you scared of?
Well, I guess non-being. Like if you don't know what life is all about or what the meaning of life is, I mean, it can lead you to horror, can't it? So I had a sense of that there must be something beyond, but not really what that was. Until I was in my early 20s, and at that time I was living and identifying as a gay woman, and committed to spending the rest of my life with another woman.
Had you always in your adulthood identified to that point as a lesbian woman?
No. When I went through puberty, as a young girl in a sense, I had a boyfriend. I had several boyfriends actually, and it was when I was around 16 that I felt this kind of drawing towards women. And I think now as I look back, I didn't really emotionally bond with my mum. I mean, mum even says today, I didn't know how to love you girls. And so I think there was a strong yearning in my heart for female affirmation and love. So that was always there. And it wasn't until I was, as I said, 16, that I just had this sense that I actually probably could be with a woman or a man. But what I think really solidified that for me was I was 18 and I got pregnant and had an abortion. And I remember very clearly at that point washing my hands of men and thinking, I don't need this. He didn't want to know about anything, and it was just a very complex, messy season. And I'd already had a relationship with a woman on and off for a couple of years. So probably people would maybe define me as bisexual at that point, and then it was a choice for me then, no, this is the path I want to go down. And in the midst of that, I was living in a community house with a whole bunch of other people. It was a big, crazy house in the inner city of Melbourne. And, many people were, gay or transgender. One of our friends was working at a local parlour. She was a prostitute. So there was a whole lot of, involvement in sexuality in various diverse ways, if you like. And Jesus just came in to that community.
Yeah.
It was quite remarkable, quite miraculous, really.
Deb's drug dealer at the time was a man named George. One day, George got picked up by the police for a stack of unpaid parking tickets and was taken to the local jail. The only book he had with him was a Bible. By the time George was released 2 weeks later, he was a born-again Christian and wanted to tell everyone about his newfound faith, starting with the people he'd sold drugs to. Deb and her friends were on his evangelical hit list, and it worked. That's how God entered Deb's life, and that's when everything began to change. I loved this passage from Deb's book, where she describes the first time she and her friends walked into a small church looking for answers.
We were a ragtag bunch of ex-prostitutes, drug dealers, gays, punks and goths. They were a fundamentalist church filled with conservative-looking old folk. These older folk had no idea what to do with us, but they did know how to love and how to pray. They somehow managed to reach across the cultural divide to lovingly embrace us and include us in the bigger church family.
A few months later, the pastor of that church baptized Deb and her friends in a river.
When you started to pursue your spirituality with Jesus, what were the immediate changes?
Gosh, well, we were doing drugs and, all sorts of crazy things.
After?
At the time, yes. Well, drugs don't automatically just drop off. I like to say those early years, we were kind of more led by the Spirit than Christians saying you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that. And so we just innately within us felt, we probably should stop taking drugs or,
wow.
There were just things that just started peeling away. And even after my baptism, I remember lighting up a cigarette and drawing the smoke down into my lungs and thinking, what am I doing? Like it just felt like I just cleansed myself with my baptism and then I'm drawing in this terrible smoke.
Yeah.
So I remember just screwed up that packet of cigarettes, threw it out and didn't smoke. So it was just, we were responding, I think, to God at work in our lives without having people telling us this is right and this is wrong, or which was lovely actually, because then when you get into the context of the church, you sure do get a lot of rights and wrongs.
Right, yeah,
Very
you don't
quickly.
really, churches don't really leave it up to individuals to figure it out with Jesus, right? We kind of draw the line in the sand and say, are you in or out?
Yes, and I think in doing that, it actually imposes a lot of regulations on people that are not owned from the inside out. It's just these external things that we put on and adhere to, but yet our heart hasn't really changed.
Right, it's the law. It's like imposing an Old Testament law on New Testament people.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
It doesn't work.
It doesn't work, and that's exactly right. And I think we are fearful to let people walk it through with Jesus.
Right.
We have to control the discipleship process and...
Well, we think we're better at it than Jesus.
Yes, I know, it's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we should trust him more.
I think we should. But it gets messy when we trust Jesus, and we don't like the messy bit, do we?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And do you remember a moment when you said to yourself, I'm not a lesbian anymore?
I don't know if it was as clear as that. I think I just started moving away from that, just naturally. And I say that, I have always said that I felt the Spirit lead me away, but, I have people now who say, well, they feel the Spirit has led them to their gay relationship. So it gets a bit complex, doesn't it, with all of that stuff?
It does.
But certainly for me, I would say that was not the path God wanted.
And you met your now husband, Alan, and immediately started dating?
Do you know what? It was a New Year's Eve party, and I opened my front door to him, and he'd been invited by his brother who knew George. And when I opened the door and met him, I knew. It was one of the oddest things that's ever happened to me. Something in my spirit reacted. And I've been a pastor for years, and when women come up to me and say, I think God's told me I'm going to marry this man, I go, sit down, love. Maybe not, that doesn't happen that often. But I knew that I didn't know what it meant. I just knew somehow our destinies were tied in together.
Did he know?
Not immediately. He was also a young believer. He'd only known Jesus a couple of years. And his journey is a particular journey because he's from a Jewish family. So that was a big deal for his family when he found Jesus. But he was really committed to a life of celibacy.
Wow.
Yes, he felt like it was going to be him and the Lord, you know. And so it took us a while
God's sense of humor, man.
Yeah, it is.
That's great.
Yeah.
You talk about, in your book, the concept of our past and how Jesus can redeem our past, and that's his business, right?
Yeah.
But he doesn't erase it.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Well, I look at it like this. I mean, when I first became a believer, I remember meeting people that had known Jesus their whole lives. And there was something so appealing about that to me. And I remember in my early years thinking, Jesus, why couldn't I have known you my whole life? Like, why did I have to go through all of the stuff that I went through? And it took me a while to kind of wrestle through some of that, because you feel the taint of some of the stuff you've been involved with. And I felt, so I had to wrestle through that with God, but I've realised that He's totally forgiven me. I was washed as white as snow in that sense, but that there was a purpose for all that I went through. I wouldn't have been able to write the book that I wrote if I hadn't have journeyed the way that I did.
And speak to the people.
That
have walked similar paths.
Yes, that's right. So I feel I understand the purpose for my background now.
You've spoken to me like very few Christian voices have been able to, especially on the issue of sexuality and sensuality, because of what a taboo subject it is. And my own journey is not that exciting. I've been with one person, and my
That's
wife.
Pretty exciting.
Well, it is exciting in its own, but the darker side of that is that growing up in the Bible Belt, in Christian circles, nobody talks about sex in real ways that address any potential issues that may be stewing in the mind or the heart of a 16-year-old Christian boy. And I discovered pornography at an early age, and it became a habit, and one that I couldn't take to Christian leaders.
No.
There was too much to lose. My dad's a pastor, and there's too much at stake. And so that just takes you further and further into the shadows, into the darkness. And then you get married, and, Christian kids always think, oh, you get married and you don't need porn anymore, or, the past will be erased and we'll start over. It's not quite how it works either.
No.
And so I would just say your willingness to speak so freely, even at conservative Christian gatherings, speak so freely and comfortably about human sexuality, I think is crucial for people like me, but also for people that have just left Christianity.
Yeah.
To hear that it's okay to be someone who believes in God, someone who leads the church, and to bust up these taboos and to speak freely about human sexual experience and pleasure and vices and, field questions with a lot of honesty and sincerity. So thank you for that. I know it's not a question, but I know you've helped a ton of people. You talk about bringing sex back to the fore of our conversation in the church. And I think that sounds really good to me on the surface, because I know what we're doing now as Christians sucks, right? We shouldn't keep doing what we're doing. But I don't know what the alternative looks like. What do you mean when you say bringing the sexy back to church?
I think in many ways what we've done is we've reduced the whole conversation around sexuality down to about sex, if you like.
You mean like intercourse?
Like intercourse, the bits and bobs, as I call it in the book, And so everything's about, our behaviours and what we do or don't do with our bits and bobs. And so in wanting to redeem sex in that sense, I want to, kind of push it back out of just the narrow conversation, put it into the bigger conversation of human sexuality. Because I find that not only not talk about it, we don't understand our sexuality. And if our whole education is solely in and around telling younger people what they can and can't do, and what is and isn't appropriate at different stages of relationships and, all of that kind of stuff, we're not giving them the bigger picture. We're not addressing other things that I think are really important and fundamental to the conversation. What is human sexuality? What is it to have a body? What is it to be in relationship with God? What does our sexuality teach us about our spirituality, and vice versa? what is it to talk about some of the longings that we have deep down?
From a theological perspective, right? That's what I see you wanting to do, is take down that dividing wall between God and sex. So we think of it as two different things, right? We experience God over here, and then we kind of do sex over here, outside of God's presence or something. And you want to bring that together. So I just ask you to explain what you think God has to do with two people or more having sex together.
Well, I think if remove it from just the two people having sex together, what does that represent? What is the oneness, the intimacy, the union there? What does that represent? It's like when I wrote in the book, imagine if heaven was like one endless orgasm, Now I'm being provocative there,
sure,
obviously, but it's like, what does an orgasm represent? What's the eternal purpose for an orgasm?
And why do we desire it?
And
so
why do we
much?
desire it? And what does it represent? And I started reflecting on that, and I thought, and for many years I worked as a counsellor with sex addicts, and I would hear the same theme coming up again and again of, first of all, just what you were talking about before, about feeling like God's over here and sexuality's over here, and so they would compartmentalise their spirituality and their sexuality. And they would see their sexuality as actually in competition to spirituality. It's like, oh, my sexuality is competing with my spirituality. If I just get my sexuality fixed up, I'll be the most spiritual person. And I began to realise we can't compartmentalise the two of them. They need to be integrated somehow, some way. And that actually our sexuality completes our spirituality because it actually points us towards our spirituality. Like all those longings we have for intimacy and connection and community. I mean, God created us as profoundly relational. We only find ourselves in relationship to others. I only become who I am meant to become in relationship to other people. That's how you become a human in a sense. And our longing for that sense of intimacy and connection, which can be expressed in a sexual union or in deep friendships that don't even have to have the genital part in it. We talk a lot about the God-shaped hole that every human has that is in need of God, that wants to worship and needs to connect with God. Well, we have a people-shaped hole as well. And I talk about this in my book, the whole 2 commandments, loving God and loving others. Jesus says, if you do these, you will live well. There will be flourishing in your life. And I think that, in a sense, is bringing our spirituality and our sexuality back together, because in the broader sense, our sexuality is not just about having sex.
I love I love all the quotes that you pull out for your book, but the Chesterton quote about every man who knocks on the door of a brothel is in search of God.
Yeah.
I love that because I think it's so true. And I think every man who watches porn, or every person that watches porn, or that pursues these empty fulfillments of our sexual desires and cravings, is really searching for something much more than that, right? Well, our podcast is called Maybe God because we try to compare different ways of looking at the world. And with this episode, we're comparing different ways of looking at sexuality, right? So orgasm is either, it appears to me, I'm a simple-minded person, but it's either one of two things. So it is what you say it is, which is this eternal, transcendent search for God, this longing for God that in a moment here on earth finds some foretaste of eternal glory in a moment of ecstasy and embrace, right?
Yep.
Or it's purely a driver of our mechanistic, Darwinian, let's propagate the species. And I sense that you want to say it really is a longing for God. And the way you start your first chapter is hilarious. The very notion that we, all of us, in every language just about, it seems, we cry out to God in that moment of ecstasy.
It's interesting, isn't it?
It is interesting. I'm not sure it's any kind of proof of anything, but it's interesting to think about. Like, why do we all cry out, oh God, in that moment? So I just think that's a very important thing for Christians to think about. Sexuality and our desire as God-given.
As God-given, that's right. Well, and it is God-given.
Yeah, it's God-given and something that actually leads us closer to God and not farther away. So you wrote this book and you said some fairly, I guess, controversial things, although I didn't find myself thinking as I was reading it that anything you said was highly controversial. But I know that anytime Christians say anything about sex, they're going to get backlash and friendly fire, oftentimes from within Christianity. Have you experienced that at all with reviews of your book or anything like that?
Overall, people have received it really well. But one of the strongest criticisms was that because I did a chapter on Jesus and sexuality, somebody said that I made Jesus too real. And I thought...
Like, how dare you?
Yeah, how dare you? And I thought, hallelujah, I'll own that. And I think, because for me, Jesus is always missing from the sex conversation.
Well, say more about what you think about his sexual personhood.
Well, I think he was a man, and we forget that. I think sometimes in certain conversations it's convenient for him to be a man, and in other conversations we see him as God. But here he was, grew up in a normal family, was a normal boy with all the urges, is going through puberty and all of that kind of stuff. So, we have to factor that in, because he's the model that we are to shape. And particularly, you think of it when we're dealing with celibacy in the context of the church. He is, in a sense, the prime model for the celibate person walking that path. Mm-hmm. And, I talk to singles all the time, and it's like if they're not going to get married, they're missing out on something. And I say, no, there are ways that you can have deep, profound relationships and friendships with people without having to have sex. And I think Jesus, again, is somebody who wasn't called to walk the path of marriage because he had the cross before him. So he needed friendships, and intimate friendships to sustain, if you like, his humanity.
Both men and women.
Both men and women. And that's another thing, that's a whole other conversation, isn't it? He didn't seem to have the same hang-ups about hanging out with women that some men, Christian men, do today.
Yeah, the Pence rule. Our vice president, who has the rule about not meeting one-on-one with a woman
yes,
ever.
That's
that comes
right.
to mind. And in this Me Too moment that we're in as a culture, I think that's on everyone's minds. Jesus didn't seem to have that hang-up. I think you're absolutely right about that. Why is it so weird or hard for Christians, you think, to think about Jesus as a sexual person? Is it because we've been conditioned to equate the urge or the desire with sin?
Yes, I think that's definitely part of it, which is so sad in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's a weird contradiction because we're saying God gives us these desires, but when you feel them, it's a sin. It doesn't add up. But I think on a gut level, we've gotten that message.
Yeah, we certainly have it. That's like the quote in the book, the Butch Hancock quote.
Right, I've got it. So my time in Lubbock, Texas, is this it?
Yes, taught me two things.
First, God loves me.
God loves me.
And I'm going to burn in hell forever or something. And the second is that sex is dirty and awful, the most filthy thing you can do. So you should save it for someone that you really love. That's a great quote.
Yeah, but there's all this kind of weird contradiction, isn't there, around it? It's just funny. I'm not sure how we got ourselves in that murky mess, but we have.
Well, it goes way back to early Christianity, where by the first few centuries, we've already decided that, Joseph never touched Mary because she could not have sinned.
Yes.
Or, she must have remained pure, which means she could not have had sex ever, which is not biblical at all. But we made that up. Christians made that up to cover for, whatever sex she might have had. And then, by the 5th or 6th century, sex is officially a sin. And you've got guys like, I think it's Bishop Jerome, who said to the men in his congregation that a man who is too passionate a lover with his own wife is a sinner.
There you go.
And, then you've got, fast forward millennia, but you've got Victorian era purity culture where you had to cover the legs of the furniture because that would evoke something in a man's, because men are just defenseless against this lust drive. And so, that kind of, I think, set the table for where we are today. I think it's the reason we're confused is on the one hand, we've got the remnants of this purity culture within Christian culture, but it's running up against this just craven idolatry of sex out in the world. Yeah. Where sex is everywhere and it's the ultimate human experience, right? And so Christians are, or anyone that's on the faith spectrum, I think is just getting mixed messages. It's very confusing.
Very confusing. Yeah.
So why do you think it is so hard for Christians to talk about sex with young people, especially with single people?
Well, I think we just have a profound discomfort. I mean, often when I'm speaking, when I mention God and orgasm or something in the same sentence, I can literally see people physically squirming in their seats. I guess it's uncommon for us. It's kind of become the realm of sin. Somehow our sexuality has become more the playground of the devil than of God. I think we've got to just be more honest with one another. And that requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is not something that is necessarily encouraged in the community of faith. But I think the first thing we've got to do is ask ourselves, why is this taboo there? Why is this weird cloud that hangs over all things sexual in the church? And really, we've got to break it. Because I think the devil, I don't want to sound simplistic, but I think this is one area that he's got his grip on, and he ought not.
Absolutely.
And the fact is, if we are called to be the people of light, one of the areas where our light is not shining is this area. We try to regulate people's sexuality. I mean, I say to people, is it the church's role to regulate sexuality anyway? Why often when we disciple somebody, that's the first thing we want to get tidied up.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, got to stop having sex with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, or you got to, all of that sort of sexual stuff is like all the first stuff on the agenda. And
why do you think that is?
Because we feel uncomfortable with that. We will entertain other sins of greed and all sorts of things in the context of the church. But the sexual ones, they're a little bit different. They're of a different order.
Right.
But, when Paul talks about sexual sin, it's always listed with a whole bunch of other sins that we kind of don't see as overly important, really.
Right.
But
idolatry, greed, gluttony.
Oh, yes, totally. Drunkenness, there's a lot of that goes on in the church.
What do you wish non-religious or agnostic or atheist people knew about the God you believe in terms of sex and sexuality?
God isn't what people think that he is, I think, half the time. I think looking in at the church and all of our kind of messed upness, I think people get a really warped sense of who God is. They see him as this Puritan kind of laying down the law and laying down the rules, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I don't see God like that at all. When I read the scriptures and when I grow in my relationship with God, he's holy, make no mistake. We don't want to mess around. God is the creator of all things. So there ought to be a sense of, whoa, but he created humans. So he's got to have a bit of fun in him because we're crazy. And I think he's just not as hung up about those sorts of things as we are. I mean, if you look at the text, the Bible, I say to people, this is the holy book. God doesn't mince words when it comes to sexuality. The prime metaphors that God uses for his relationship with his people are sexual metaphors. The Old Testament, Israel, it was God's wife. And more often than not, if you read the prophets, she's the adulteress. She gets called a whore. We clean it up in the English translations, in the Hebrew.
A lot of passages get cleaned up.
Oh, they get cleaned up. In the Hebrew, the prophets just say it. You have, Israel, you have committed adultery, you've spread your legs to other gods. I mean, that's graphic kind of
It is.
imagery.
And then there's Song
there.
of Songs.
Song of Songs, I don't even know what to do with Song of Songs. It's kind of a crazy book right there in the middle of the holy book,
Yep. And it was never taken out. It could have been taken out. Could have been whitewashed.
Could have been.
And it's not a metaphor for something, just purely religious. It is hypersexual.
It is hypersexual. So for me, I think I just want people to know God doesn't have the same hang-ups that Christians do.
Yeah.
What does it say about God that he created the orgasm? Think about that. This is a God of pleasure, and I think in the church, we find that hard to embrace, that God is a God of pleasure. We elevate fasting on the one hand, the denial side of things, but we don't elevate feasting. Yes, there's seasons for fasting, but there's seasons for feasting. I'm writing at the moment on the senses, and I been thinking about taste buds. God didn't have to give us taste buds, but he wants us to feel the pleasure, to feel the delight of the different flavours that we have. So what do our taste buds say about God? These are the things I wish people that don't believe in God knew about God. You know, this is not some bound up, crazy kind of moralistic sort of being. This is a God that can have a lot of fun.
Right.
I think the church, we've misrepresented, haven't we, throughout history, misrepresented our God.
And in this particular moment of the church's history, the LGBT community seems to be on the forefront of everyone's minds in churches. Like, who are we going to be to our LGBT communities? So I would just kind of pose the same question to you. What do you wish LGBT people and communities knew about God that maybe they're not hearing from churches?
Oh dear, that's a big one, isn't it? First of all, I mean, the obvious thing for me to say, and I don't just say it, but I believe it, you know, God is a God of all. You know, he created humans in all different shapes and sizes and colours and expressions, and, you know, and God's table is open to all. I mean, that's really important to me. God has a big table and everyone is invited. Not everyone responds,
sure,
but everyone is invited. And I think what would I like them to know is, you know, first of all, sorry for the way the church has misunderstood and judged. We don't do well with people that are different. Not just sexual minorities, just generally people who are different. I mean, that breaks my heart.
Yeah.
Because I think, you know, again, I think the scriptures, when we read them, God is always, you know, going for those on the margins or those that have been excluded or pushed aside. That's our God, which is what I love about God. You know, Jesus goes the extra mile to make sure people are included. And the ones that often that he kind of excludes, if you like, are the ones that are the religious in many ways,
right,
which is kind of fascinating.
Jesus says prostitutes will get into heaven before the most religious dudes will.
There you go.
Profound, right?
It is profound.
Lost on us sometimes.
It's totally lost on us.
Yeah.
You know, and so I guess for me, you know, the people that we've excluded, we always need to start with an apology and just say, sorry, we messed up, and try to do better.
So what should churches do with people who are earnestly seeking Jesus, who may be in the LGBT communities? I know in most churches, probably, it's something of a deal breaker to come out or to be out. And so what would your advice to well-meaning, well-intentioned churches be?
Okay, well, you're getting into complicated kind of territory with all of this because, you know, when you're starting to deal with some of the theological issues there around whether, you know, God wants people, is it outside of his protective boundary, you know, gay relationships, all that kind of stuff. I say, you know, my first thing with any person that is gay or transgender or whatever is help build the relationship with Jesus. That's the most important thing we can do. That's what we're called to do. Help people fall deeper and deeper in love with Jesus Christ. And in the context of that, they grow and they kind of learn about him and the decisions that they make, therefore, beyond that. That's where it becomes complex because maybe decisions they're making in terms of whether they're going to have a partner or not, whether they're going to walk the celibate path or whether they're going to pursue, you know, gay relationships. That's the tricky bit because we don't all agree on all of these things.
Right, yeah. That's where it all kind of tends to fall apart and people use those things as major litmus tests.
Yes.
For, you know, are you liberal or are you conservative and all that stuff. It kind of drives me crazy because it gets us out of the most important question, which is, are we introducing as many people as possible to Jesus?
Yeah.
Right, and that should be more important to us than the other side issues. And the other part that drives me crazy, as you pointed out in your book at times, is how we treat some people as sexually broken and we act like we're not sometimes.
Yes.
So as a straight, heterosexual, married man who's been faithful to his wife, I'm using air quotes for those of you listening, faithful because, you know, the porn thing wasn't, you know, and my own imagination gets away from me sometimes. And like your line in the book that stuck with me is that it's not just some orientations that are disoriented. We're all disoriented.
Absolutely.
Because of your understanding of the fall and how sin works. Could you say more about what you meant with that?
Yeah, well, often when I'm leading sessions, when we're discussing the whole LGBT conversation, we start with what I call that the micro conversation. and we get stuck there because it's all about the rights and wrongs and what should we do and all that sort of stuff. And it's,
Are they born that way or not?
All of the questions that go along with that. So I say, let's not get stuck in the micro conversation. It's not that it's not important. It's profoundly important. It's one of the conversations for our time. But let's take it always to the macro conversation, which is a conversation of human sexuality, which actually incorporates all of us. So when we're talking about broken parts of our sexuality, we're not just talking about sexual minorities, which tends to be the way, or those broken people over there, which is a highly offensive word to use.
Yeah, it is.
And they feel that. It's like, well, don't call me broken, I'm not broken. And so I say to people, hang on a minute, we're all broken. You know, like you said, all of our orientations are disoriented. All of us are profoundly messed up when it comes to our sexuality. It's too easy for those of us that think we've got it together to point to those people over there or to the woman caught in adultery. You know, I mean, that's a great story in John chapter 8 there.
Yes,
you know, what Jesus does there, the first thing he does is he levels everybody. You know, he's these righteous religious people with their stones, and God's word gave them every authority to kill this woman now. And here they are, righteous, you know, standing there probably with their chests puffed out. And he looks at them and says, okay, whoever's, you know, without sin, you get to go first. And so there's this kind of, I can imagine this kind of corporate,
Exactly.
They put their stones down, and what he's doing there is he's actually pushing them down. He's lowering them in their righteousness, and then he looks at the woman and he lifts her up and he brings them to this level place. And I think we must start there. None of us are above anybody else in that sense. So we're all messed up. Let's just own that, and then let's try to move forward, all of us together, to wholeness and to healthy expression of our sexuality and all of that. So it's the macro conversation says we're all in it together, and it's a bigger conversation. Again, because if you really had to narrow down the LGBT conversation, as I see it in the church at the moment, it's all about really whether gay people can have sex or not.
Right.
Like, how narrow is that?
Yeah.
You know, and we're stuck there arguing over the ethics of whether that's right or wrong. And
Well, we're losing people
Totally
because
losing
of this micro conversation. They're just flocking out of the churches because we're stuck in this micro conversation, and they know it, and they see, you know, how limited and immature really we're being with that a lot of the time. And instead of really being who we say we are, which is first and foremost about Jesus, and the love of Jesus, and making sure everyone knows Jesus and what his life, death, and resurrection means for them, we get caught up in these side conversations, and it gets pretty ugly. What mistakes do you see American parents making when talking to their teenagers about sex?
well, again, don't just start with the sex stuff. Get the bigger picture again. Again, we're getting into micro conversations, you know, about whether you should or shouldn't have sex. Or
It's almost a default.
Right. We'll talk to them about their bodies, about sensuality, about becoming people that are more in tune with who they are, slowing things down, developing their social sexual relationships.
Wait, what does that mean?
Most of the relationships we have, I would say, are in the category of social sexuality, which is our need for intimacy and love, you know, separate from the genital needs that we have.
Got it.
Most of them, of our relationships, are non-genital, aren't they?
I think so. Yes, indeed.
Well, there's only certain people that will turn us on, if you like. And I always say to people, you have to be thankful for that, because if everybody turned us on, we wouldn't get around to doing much else, would we?
Right.
We'd be focused on one area. But help them to understand the gift of true friendship. You know, the whole concept Paul talks about of what it is to be brother and sister in Christ. You know, there's so much room within that to feel deeply and passionately for one another, you know. I think what we do is we reserve all that passion and that feeling for the person we're meant to marry, but we can't feel deeply for other people. And I don't think
So it
that's
works,
right.
it serves to build the taboo up more with our young people.
Yes.
Is what you're saying.
Yes.
If we just trump up this one big issue over here and separate from every other facet of our lives, it's almost like, you know, the kid that's told that alcohol is the worst thing, and then they go to college and completely lose their minds.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's exactly right. Broaden it out. All of us need to be taught about boundaries around our sexuality, because if it's boundaryless, my goodness me, we can end up in very, very dark places. So boundaries are okay, but don't just teach boundaries. Give big picture stuff and just have this sense of, whoa, so much bigger. There is so much capacity in us to grow in depth and wonder and love and come alive to the world around us and to each other. Those things are deeply satisfying. And I remember when I worked with sex addicts, they were mainly gay men who were addicted to usually anonymous sexual encounters. And what we found was when they began to build relationships with others, particularly with other men, non-erotic relationships, they realised that their longing was actually deeper. It wasn't just about having an orgasm. They needed friendship. And wow. I'll never forget one story. I remember a client of mine coming in to my office, and he looked at me, and I knew something fundamental had happened to him, and he went in to have an anonymous encounter with somebody. It's always great when they do that just before they come in for a counselling session. He's saying, what is wrong with me?
They got to have something to talk to you about.
Well, maybe. But he told me the story that he went into this place and a man came in and offered him his hand. And my client said he took this man's hand and this, thinking it was going to lead on to some sort of sexual encounter. And the man took his hand and he just held it, and he squeezed his hand and he looked straight into his eyes. And my client said to me, his gaze, it was like he was peering into me. He said, and it was just, I could see love in his eyes. He said, and it was like this endless kind of moment. He said it probably only lasted for a few moments, but it felt endless. He said, and this man just dropped my hand, turned around and walked out. He said, and I began to tremble. And he said, I knew at that moment, he said, it wasn't sex that I wanted. I just needed a man to hold me. And he then said to me, which I'll never forget it, I wondered whether that man that came, whether it was an angel, Debbie. And I said to him, do you know what? It could have been an angel. It sounds exactly like what the God that we follow would do, would send an angel in there. And my client turned around at that point. Now, I'm not saying that's all there is to everybody's addiction, but for him, the revelation that it wasn't the orgasm he needed, he just needed to be loved and held by a man.
And he had made the switch in his brain at some point that it was the orgasm. It was the sex, and all along it was something else. That's why he could never fill the void, no matter how many encounters.
No. And I found that when men started building strong relationships with other men, just blokes that they could, feel affirmed by and all that kind of stuff, their need for sexual encounters diminished. Didn't always take it all away.
Sure, yeah.
But something else was being filled. And I think all addiction is an issue of the heart.
I've got to ask you one more question before we run out of time. What would you say to someone who's of a mind that our sexuality is a purely Darwinian drive and all animal species do it, and it's just life wanting to go forward, and that's why it feels good, is because evolution has made it such that sex feels good, so that we'll want to do more of it, so that we can, drive our species forward into the future. Yeah. What do you say to that person?
Well, first of all, I'd say, yes, there is that side of it. We are humans, we have bodies, we do function in some ways like the animals. I mean, there's no denying some of that. So I would say, yes, there is that, but we are more than that. And I think that, I think we see this in the Bible. We are higher than the animals, lower than the angels. There is something different about humans because we bear the mark of God in who we are. And so I would say that I think every human knows in their most vulnerable moment, maybe they're vulnerable in their sense of nakedness, maybe in the act of sex, of giving of themselves in that. You tap into something that is beyond your own self, that is beyond just the animal, nature, if you like.
It does seem so, right?
I think there's something sacred about sex that takes us beyond ourselves to the other, the greater other.
What I love most about Deb is how fearless she is. She talks about orgasms and masturbation the way most of us talk about the weather. And her courage is contagious. As I talked to her, I felt free to share parts of my own past with porn addiction and lust, the kind of stuff pastors like me aren't always safe to talk about. There's something about her that changes the conversation. I felt loved by Deb. I think it's her loving presence that took away my fear of being judged. Everybody thinks hate is the opposite of love, but really it's not. Fear is. Which got me thinking about why we're not having better conversations about these issues in our culture today. And I think it's because most of our conversations about sex, conversations about pleasure, fantasies, boundaries, pornography, conversation about sexual preference, sexual orientation, sexual identity, I think it's all being governed by fear instead of love. And maybe if we started from a place of love instead of fear, maybe we'd be having better conversations about these issues that are ripping our culture apart at the seams. Now, the good news is we've got more of Deb's wisdom to share with you next week. When we met in LA, she was kind enough to answer some of our listeners' questions. And we'll share her responses as part of next week's episode. We're leaving the rest of our next episode wide open for your other questions. So as I was talking with Deb, if other questions came to the surface for you and you want me to address some of those in our next episode, please send them our way to maybegodpod@gmail.com, maybegodpod@gmail.com. And please don't worry, of course, all questions will be held in confidence, and I'm not going to be using anyone's real names in the Q&A portion of that episode. So guys, I really hope you'll send in your questions just as soon as possible, and obviously I hope you'll tune in next week for more of Deb Hirsch on Maybe God.
Maybe God is produced by Julie Neely-Courtois, Eric Huffman, and me, Brandon Duke. Our sound engineer is Pat Lowry, our editor is Brittany Holland, and our theme music is by Nathan Bonus. If you have questions or doubts that you would like us to address in upcoming episodes of Maybe God, email us at maybegodpod@gmail.com or start a discussion on our Facebook page, Maybe God Podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe now and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app.